Claire Turner was the kind of woman who kept her heart wrapped in silence. At 34, living alone in a cozy apartment just outside downtown Seattle, she had built a quiet life, a safe life. She worked as a senior editor at a small publishing house, spending her days helping others tell their stories while hers remained tucked away in the quiet corners of her mind. Claire had been in love once deeply, painfully, but when her engagement ended without warning 3 years ago, something inside her closed off. Since then, she told herself she didn't need romance anymore. Not the kind that made your chest ache or your breath catch. Love, in her eyes, had become more of a memory than a possibility. Then, one rainy morning in early fall, something shifted. It was just another Thursday. Claire had her usual black coat on, her scarf wrapped tight against the wind, and a book in her hand as she walked into Maple and Oak, a small coffee shop she visited almost every morning before work. The place smelled like cinnamon and roasted espresso beans, warm, familiar. But that morning, as she ordered her vanilla oat latte and glanced toward the corner table by the window, she noticed someone new, a man, maybe mid-30s. He sat, alone, fingers curled around a chipped white mug, writing quietly in a worn leather journal. He wasn't flashy, no loud clothes, no designer watch, but there was something about him, the stillness, the way he focused, the quiet strength in his posture. She didn't mean to look twice, but he did. Their eyes met for the briefest second. Brown eyes, thoughtful and steady, looked straight into hers, not like a stranger's, but like someone who saw her before she even had time to hide. Claire blinked and looked away quickly, pretending to read the back of her book. Her heart fluttered, just slightly, like it hadn't in years. She told herself it was nothing, just a random glance. But it stayed with her, even as she walked to work under the soft gray sky, latte warming her hand. The next morning, he was there again. Same table, same journal. He didn't look at her this time, but she felt his presence like a quiet hum. It became a pattern. Day after day, Claire found herself arriving just a little earlier, hoping to see him. She noticed the small things, how he always ordered black coffee, how he sometimes stared out the window as if lost in another world, how he tapped his pen twice before writing anything down. It became her secret routine, a connection without words, a tension that neither of them acknowledged, yet somehow both seemed to lean into. There was no flirting, no smiles, just glances that held too long, and silences that felt charged with something unspoken. Claire began to wonder about him. What he was writing, if he was single, if he noticed her as much as she noticed him. She didn't believe in love at first. Sight she still didn't, but this felt like something else. A beginning that didn't ask for permission. A pull she hadn't expected. She told herself not to fall for a stranger, but her heart had already started listening, and even though they hadn't exchanged a single word, Claire knew deep in her chest that something had begun. Something quiet, something real, and maybe, just maybe, something impossible to ignore. Asterisk by the time Claire and Daniel finally spoke, it had already felt like something was growing between them, something quiet but undeniable. For weeks, their connection had stayed hidden beneath stolen glances and morning routines at Maple and Oak, that cozy Seattle coffee shop with the foggy windows and the warm smell of cinnamon. Every time Claire walked in and saw him always at the same table, always with that leather journal, her heart did something strange. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild, but it was steady, like a soft pull, drawing her toward a possibility she didn't quite dare to name. She kept telling herself not to get carried away. He was just a stranger, a man who drank coffee and wrote in silence. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The way he looked at her, careful, curious, as though he already knew she had a story worth hearing, wasn't something Claire could explain away. And then one morning, the universe gave them a nudge. She reached for the sugar jar on the counter just as he did. Their fingers brushed warm skin against warm skin, brief but electric. Both of them froze for half a second before pulling back. Sorry, Claire said, startled. He smiled for the first time, slow and soft. No, I'm sorry. His voice was calm, a little rough, like it hadn't been used much lately. That simple exchange made her feel strangely exposed, like she'd just stepped out from behind some invisible curtain. He looked at her for a moment, before adding, I'm Daniel. She almost laughed because, of course, he had a name, and now she finally knew it. Claire, she replied, her voice low, caught somewhere between nervous and thrilled. That was all it took to break the silence. From then on, every morning brought something new. A comment about the weather, a shared joke about the too loud blender. He'd ask what she was reading. She'd ask if he was writing something personal or for work. He never said much, but what he did say mattered. She learned he was originally from Toronto, now living in Seattle while working remotely as a copywriter. He'd lost his mom the year before, and writing helped him breathe through the grief. Claire found herself opening up to more than she expected. She told him about her job in publishing, her love for old poetry, and even the fact that she used to believe in big, cinematic love until it broke her. Their conversations were still short, still subtle, but something had shifted. The coffee shop no longer felt like just a routine. It felt like a shared space, a quiet ritual that belonged only to them. And yet, neither one made a move. There were no dates, no numbers exchanged. Just mornings filled with soft voices and eyes that spoke louder than words ever could. Claire knew she was walking a fine line. She had built walls after her heartbreak tall ones, and she wasn't sure she was ready to let someone back in. But every time Daniel looked at her, as if he saw the things she wasn't saying, her defenses trembled. Still, she told herself to stay careful. What they had was beautiful in its own way, unspoken, gentle, untouched by expectations. She didn't want to ruin it by hoping for too much, but deep down, hope was already blooming in her chest. Then, one morning, she walked into the coffee shop and stopped cold. His table was empty. No journal, no coffee, no Daniel. And as the minutes ticked by, her heart sank with a truth she hadn't wanted to face. He was gone, and maybe he wasn't coming back. Claire had always been someone who handled silence well. She was the kind of woman who enjoyed rainy afternoons with a book, who didn't mind eating dinner alone, who found peace in the soft spaces where other people often felt lonely. But this silence, this was different. Daniel's absence was the kind of quiet that felt sharp, like it had weight. It wasn't just that he wasn't at the coffee shop. His seat by the window sat empty, like a missing piece of something fragile. Every morning for a week, Claire walked into Maple and Oak with a mix of hope and dread. Scanning the room with a careful glance she tried to pretend was casual. But he never came, and she never said a word to anyone. How could she explain the ache she felt for someone she'd barely touched? For a connection that hadn't even had the chance to fully begin? Still, his absence echoed through her days. She kept remembering the way he used to look at her, as if he was memorizing her face. The way he'd ask her what she was reading, but not just to be polite, he genuinely wanted to know. Claire thought about their quiet mornings, their shared moments, and all the things they'd never gotten around to saying. She had wanted more. She just hadn't said it out loud. Now she wondered if she'd missed her chance. And the worst part, she had no way to find him. No last name, no number, nothing. All she knew was that his name was Daniel. He came from Toronto, and he wrote in a leather-bound journal, like he was carrying pieces of his soul in those pages. She tried to move on. She buried herself in work. She told herself it had just been a moment, a phase, a gentle attraction that had never turned into anything real. But at night, when she was alone and the world was quiet, Claire missed him in a way that felt painfully real. She hadn't even known how deep she'd fallen until he wasn't there to smile at her in the morning. It wasn't the drama of heartbreak, it was something softer, sadder, a longing she hadn't been ready for. Then, 10 days after she last saw him, something happened. She was walking to her car after a long day at the office, the sky bruised with clouds and the wind starting to pick up. Her hands were full her bag, a coffee cup, her keys, and at first, she didn't notice anything different. But when she reached for the car door, she saw it, a folded piece of paper taped gently to the window. Her name written in neat, familiar handwriting. Claire's heart stopped. She pulled it off, her fingers suddenly trembling, and opened the letter with the kind of urgency only a heart in waiting could understand. Claire, I didn't want to disappear like this, but I had to leave. My father's sick, very sick, and I had to fly back to Toronto on short notice. I didn't have time to say goodbye, and maybe that's my fault. But I couldn't leave without saying something. I don't know what this is between us, or if you even feel it too, but I do. I've felt it every morning since the first day we looked at each other. And if there's even a small part of you that feels the same, please, don't forget me. Daniel Clare stood in the cold parking lot for a long time, the wind biting at her cheeks as tears filled her eyes. Because in that moment, all the walls she'd built cracked open. She had felt it. She had wanted it. And now, she finally knew she hadn't been imagining it, but she had no idea if she would ever see him again. 2 months. That's how long. It had been since Claire read Daniel's letter, standing alone in that chilly parking lot with her heart wide open and aching. Since then, life had gone on around her. People moved through their days. Coffee still brewed each morning. The rain still came and went in its usual rhythm, but for Claire, nothing felt quite the same. She stopped going to Maple and Oak. The quiet charm of the place, once filled with warmth and shared glances, now felt hollow. Her mornings, once something she looked forward to, became empty routines again. She tried to distract herself with work, friends, long walks around Green Lake, but Daniel's words lived rent-free in her chest, tucked away like a secret she didn't know what to do with. She wondered about him constantly. Was he still in Toronto? Was his father okay? Did he think about her the way she thought about him? Quietly, deeply, in those still moments when the world slowed down. It would have been easier if he'd never left that note. Then she could have convinced herself it was one-sided, that their connection was only in her imagination. But the truth was, Daniel had felt it too. He had seen her the way few people ever really had. And now that she knew that, moving on didn't feel like an option, it felt like a lie. She wasn't in love, not yet, but she was close. Close enough to miss him in a way that surprised her. Close enough to hope he'd find a way back. And then, on a quiet Friday evening, it happened. Claire was at home, curled up on her couch in a faded hoodie, flipping through an old poetry book she'd read a dozen times. Her phone buzzed. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she picked it up, her breath caught an email. From Daniel. Claire, I'm coming back to Seattle this weekend. I don't know if you're still around or if you've moved on, but if you haven't, I'd love to see you. If you want to, read it 3 times, barely blinking. Her hands were shaking. She didn't hesitate. Yes, tell me when and where. They met 2 days later. Maple and Oak, of course. Same table, same corner, only now the place felt different. Claire walked in and saw him waiting older somehow, softer around the edges. His brown eyes lit up the second he saw her, like she was exactly who he'd been hoping to see. And when she sat across from him, neither of them said anything right away. There was no need. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of everything they had carried separately, now ready to be shared. I thought I lost my chance, Daniel said finally, his voice low. Claire smiled, but her eyes were glassy. I thought you'd forget. He shook his head. I couldn't. I tried. She reached across the table, slowly, and laid her hand over his. It was warm, familiar, real. I don't want to wonder anymore, she said softly. I don't want to hide from it, Daniel nodded. Me neither. And just like that, what once was hidden and delicate bloomed into something undeniable. They didn't need grand promises or dramatic declarations. What they had was quieter than that, but stronger, grown from patience, distance, and the simple, soul-deep recognition that sometimes the right person doesn't rush in. Sometimes they find you slowly, in the most ordinary places, and change everything. What started as a quiet connection had become something they couldn't walk away from, because love like that doesn't shout. It lingers. And it waits until you're finally ready to say yes.